This next one is another one of my favorite records, as all of these are. This one, this is the Oscar Peterson Trio +1 with Clark Terry. This is kind of my favorite feel-good record. If you put this on and you don't feel great, you have a problem. It's basically the way I feel. So this is another actually also fantastic sounding record. This is Mercury Stereo in the day when they were, I think it's Robert Fine engineered. And anyway, it's a great sounding Mercury Stereo. And this is Oscar Peterson Trio at their prime, Clark Terry at his prime. And I mean, this is just phenomenal, incredible trumpet playing, like really glorious trumpet playing, and it's interesting and it's fun, and it just makes me happy, and I can't imagine it doesn't do the same for everybody. So it's a really great record. It's, you know, Clark Terry does his mumbling scatting thing on one track, which is sort of funny, and but it's amazing. Oscar Peterson playing, it's amazing. You know, the whole band, Ed Thigpen, you know, the Ray Brown. It's definitive in all aspects of the band. And I guess on another personal note, where I grew up just outside Toronto, you know, my first instrument was piano. And when I was young, Dad had a friend on the street that backed onto ours, and was sort of on the street that backed onto us and down a few houses. And my dad worked with him, and he had a couple of sons that were roughly the same age as my brother and I. And they had a neighbor who was a pianist, and his name was Oscar Peterson. And so I grew up on the street that backed onto Oscar Peterson's house. Yeah, this Oscar Peterson.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And yeah. So I mean, Oscar Peterson, for anyone living in Canada, is like a, you know, national treasure, and and particularly, you know, whatever in our neighborhood. But and I never knew him or anything. It's mostly like symbolic in nature, but it's cool. You know, Oscar Peterson has that sort of special place for me because of that. But I would say this record, Clark Terry. This is just like incredible Clark Terry, who is, you know, by far the most original trumpet player, you know, the most easily identifiable trumpet player that there is. And this is just like definitive Clark Terry playing. I mean, there aren't any bad Clark Terry records, but this is like really definitive Clark Terry for me. This is a well-known, iconic record. This is Glenn Gould's Goldberg Variations, which he recorded in 1955 or 6. This was this is another case that has like a little bit of a personal connection, both in that being from Toronto, Glenn Gould is a Toronto, you know, one of the major musical hometown heroes of Toronto. And for me personally, it was really Glenn Gould that got me really deep into classical music, and I began listening to his records, and he's very controversial in the classical world, and there are many pianists and non-pianists alike who despise his playing or respect it to some degree. There's a very wide degree of strong opinions. He was very unorthodox, and I think the thing is, as a jazz musician, I think all of the things that maybe annoy more, you know, classical musicians who that's their field, his approach does not work for them, and I think it appeals to a jazz philosophy where basically, you know, I mean, his interpretation is a very big part of his playing, and he plays in very unorthodox ways, and somewhat, in some cases, somewhat different than what the composer specified. In some cases, completely different from what the composer specified, particularly with tempos, but also it was not unusual for him to change notes and add ornaments that weren't written and not play ornaments that were written. And he did all kinds of things differently. And, you know, I couldn't say that every one of those things I love, but I do appreciate his creative approach and his philosophy of that, you know, no matter what is supposed to happen, his approach was to try to make the most music that he could find, see what he could discover in a piece of music, and present it the way, you know, a way that he thought got something interesting across in the music. So for people whose view is more like, this is Bach's music and Bach wrote it, and the performer's job is to present Bach's intention, you know, to a listening audience, that's not what Glenn Gould did, you know. So I totally respect that rubs people the wrong way, but for me, I mean, I enjoy it musically, and I kind of got into it like just loving the playing before I was aware of like how controversial all this stuff was. But he famously played his U.S. debut, and I believe it was at Carnegie Hall, and it was on January 1st, 1955 or 56, and I'm forgetting which year. And famously, the New York Times review was, "We've just heard the best performance of this year." And he was promptly signed to a lifetime contract with Columbia Records, and this was his debut recording. Wow. And this sort of changed. This really brought Bach to the forefront, where at the time in the mid '50s, I guess it was really with Pablo Casals in the 30s, and through the earlier part of the 20th century, Bach was gaining. There were some champions of Bach who were sort of saying like, Bach is, you know, this important music, but there was a long-standing view that it was like music for students, and it was you know, old music that was, you know, not really relevant anymore, and so important to learn when you're learning, you know, when you're learning certain things, but not really great music that should be appreciated. And it was Glenn Gould was one of the major people, particularly on piano, that made Bach a thing. You know, that brought Bach to public awareness, because he had this very unique way of playing, and people were hearing like, oh wow, I've heard this on harpsichord, you know, a bunch of times played this way, but this has a whole new thing when it's played this way, and it's when it's played with these unusual articulations. And this for me is just, and I mean, this piece of music, the Goldberg variations, there's all kinds of math involved. I mean, the design of them by, you know, Bach's, you know, the movements all mirror one another, and there's, you know, a three-voice movement followed by a two-voice movement followed by a four-voice movement, or you know, whatever and they all mirror one another, and it starts and ends the same way, and it's I mean, it's a masterpiece of a piece of music to begin with. And then Glenn Gould's interpretation of it and performance of it are great, and I mean, really changed. You know, for all of his detractors, you know, it had a major impact in the classical music world. This was Scott's first stereo preamp. It has a lot of functions, you know, which nowadays a lot of people are not into many functions. They like, you know, simpler circuits and stuff, which I can totally understand. But it's nice. Particularly, what I like about it is, I mean, it's beautiful. They look nice. It has different EQs for the different LP compensations. So basically. Wow. before 1955, before things really became standardized, each company had their own EQ curve that they would cut LPs with. And basically, when you cut an LP, you have to roll off the bass frequencies in order for the grooves to fit, And then what you do is in the preamp, you do the reverse and you boost the bass, and there's some adjustments to the treble and everything, so that you wind up with a flat signal, and what went on the record comes out on the other end, and you just have like two filters that do the opposite thing. So, but what happened was there were all kinds of different, each company would come up with their own standard of which EQ they were using. And so really early, mono era preamps before stereo would have a bunch of dials, and you would adjust, the 500 hertz turnover to this, and you'd adjust this, so this being early stereo, people were still listening to records from that time. There's 5 different settings depending on records. So, I have some old mono LPs from that time period, and you put on a Columbia, an early Columbia record, and with the standard, the industry standard RIAA curve. Sometimes it sounds a little bit lackluster. It depends on the recording a little bit, but it's nice to be able to adjust for what Columbia manufactured those records for. It's got a phase reverse, which is actually kind of useful for checking some things. It's got loudness, and then it's got bass and treble controls and balance. And then with this, it's got a stereo selector, which a lot of preamps from the time had, where I can have it in, and these lights sort of correspond to what I'm doing. So I can have stereo or mono, the 2 channels summed, so it's the same thing out of both speakers. I can listen to just one channel or just the other channel, like just one speaker or just the other speaker, or I can reverse left and right, or I can listen to the left speaker through both speakers, or the right channel through both speakers. So that's kind of handy actually for the mono table. It helps get the best signal out of that, I guess.
Those have such a chunky sound.
Yeah, I mean, it's high quality stuff, from 59 or whenever this was, and works great.